One of the biggest passages of wealth from generation to generation happens through home ownership. Yet, due to centuries of legal housing discrimination, the rate at which people of color, and specifically Black people, have been able to access home ownership and the wealth building that it affords has been significantly impaired. In fact, when this data first started to be tracked, reporting agencies found that homeownership rates varied so widely across racial lines that they had to categorize them by race in order to present an accurate picture, right? And we all know how important home is, right? And the social determinants of well-being that are tied to place, things like access to quality education and adequate health care. And so for those of you who, like me, are visual people, these are our current homeownership rates. You can see there at the top our white brothers and sisters with a rate of just over 70%. There in the middle, our Hispanic brothers and sisters with a rate of just over 50%. And then there at the bottom, our Black brothers and sisters with a rate of just over 40%. Oh, but not in Altadena, right? An exception to these statistics, Altadena is a community where the Black population had a homeownership rate of around 80%, or almost double the national average. Yes, that's right. Amen. Amen. Yes. Altadena represented a community that defied neighborhood norms at the time, not only because of the increased Black homeownership rate, but also because of the ethnic diversity of all races, socioeconomic diversity, and diversity of thought. Then came January 7th, right? That night will remain forever ingrained in our memories. As a resident of Eaton Canyon, just a stone's throw from Altadena, we were notified that our power would be going out as a precautionary measure. So we made the decision to take our two girls to their grandparents' house so they could do their homework and maybe have some dinner, thinking we'd be back in time for bedtime. An hour and a half later, our neighborhood text thread blew up saying the canyon is on fire, get out now. We then had to decide if we were going to try and go back into the fire to rescue our dog and anything else that we could grab, or heed the warnings and stay put. Ultimately, we decided on the former, due in no small part to the cries and pleas and sobs of our daughters, begging us to please go and rescue their beloved baguette. So that's what we did. My husband and my father-in-law drove back into the fire zone when everyone was driving out, and thankfully were able to rescue the dog and return safely. Miraculously, our home was spared. We moved home in June, but so many others, it was a completely different story. And while we know that natural disasters don't intend to discriminate on the basis of race or class or any other factor, and the devastation was so widespread and people are everywhere of all ethnicities are navigating unspeakable hardship. But we also know that natural disasters do discriminate on the basis of race in some ways because there is often disparate impact on communities of color and lower income communities after natural disasters. And unfortunately, Altadena was no different. In fact, UCLA did a study that showed that 61% of Black households were located within the fire perimeter as compared to only 50% of non-Black households. Similarly, 48%, almost 50% of Black households were either destroyed completely or damaged significantly as compared to 37% of non-Black households. So how did Altadena come to be this thriving, diverse community with a Black homeownership rate that was double the national average, many generational homes that have been in families all the way back into the 1800s for some, at a time when housing segregation was actually the norm? To understand that, it's important to understand what was happening policy-wise throughout history at the federal, state, and local levels, and how that impacted housing access in communities across the country, and ultimately, the demographic distribution of the city of Altadena. Now, I recognize we're not here for a history lesson, and maybe we don't need that, but what we do need is context. If we're to understand what's at stake in Black Altadena, how it came to be, and why it's so crucial that it is restored. So bear with me, we're just gonna go on a mini history lesson, if that's okay. And I need the clicker for the next slide. Yep. So after the Great Depression, the federal government intervened with a number of programs intended to spur the economy and really get it back on track as part of President Roosevelt's New Deal era initiatives. One such program was the creation of the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was intended to purchase distressed mortgages from homeowners that were in distress to prevent foreclosure. This was created in 1939. They instituted a color-coded rating system to analyze risk, with minority neighborhoods consistently receiving the lowest or red ratings and non-minority neighborhoods receiving the highest or green ratings. And so that's an actual homeowners loan corporation map of Altadena, which again informs the demographic distribution of the city in a lot of ways. It's also important to consider what was happening in Pasadena, right, throughout history. At one point in the city of Pasadena, over 60% of the homes had racially restrictive covenants attached to them, which meant that they were not able to be sold or transferred to anyone who was non-white, right? Therefore, people had to look elsewhere if they were going to achieve the dream of homeownership, and for many, that meant Altadena. Thank you. And so then in 1949, the Federal Housing Act was passed, right, which funded a national initiative called Urban Renewal, which identified properties as blighted or areas as blighted with the intention of developing there things that were new or nicer to kind of spur community development, right? The only problem is that often neighborhoods that were deemed blighted were not so. They were actually just non-white, right? In fact, urban renewal led to the demolition of a 102-acre development in Pasadena called the Pepper Street Projects that was inhabited primarily by families of color. When it was demolished, many of those families of color, which was to the tune of, it was over 90% of the families in the Pepper Projects were communities of color, they relocated to Altadena. And then in 1956, the National Interstate and Defense Highways Act was passed, which was great because it funded an interstate highway system that was supposed to connect transportation corridors, and that's a good thing. But what it also did was give city planning departments across the country license to erect physical barriers to segregate neighborhoods. Friends, if you go to almost any major city in the United States of America, you will see that the freeway intersected minority communities and put them on a different side of the tracks than the rest of the community, almost universally. And so in Pasadena, with the construction of the 210 freeway, it primarily displaced families of color, many of whom also relocated to Altadena, where they were able to access homeownership in an easier fashion. And then in 1968, the Fair Housing Act was passed, which was great because it made it illegal everywhere to discriminate on the basis of race, among other protected classes, right, in the sale, rental, and financing of housing. But what it didn't do was erase the legacy of redlining and led to black people being more likely to be located in areas prone to hazards because they were often areas of the city that were less desirable, sometimes less accessible, and therefore more affordable. This legacy led to the long-term concentration of black residents in those parts of Altadena that happened to be located closest to the Eaton fire zone, and therefore contributed to the vulnerability of a larger number of black households impacted by the fires. So these policies are no means exhaustive, right? But again, creates the landscape of what was happening nationally, state level, and locally that informed the demographic distribution, not only of Altadena, friends, but of cities across the country. Segregation is not an accident. And while Altadena certainly wasn't perfect, right, and redlining definitely did exist, it still represented a respite for people seeking to attain home ownership and put down roots, with some families being there since the 1800s. Friends, if you don't get anything else out of this talk, please hear me when I say that there is more at stake for the Black community in recovery than just homes. If we do not provide access to the resources and information necessary for all people to rebuild, and especially the Black community, to rebuild and restore and remain, we'll see generations of wealth wiped out and a community fractured. And I've provided a lot of statistics and history and policy, but it's also important to remember we're talking about real people with real stories who have generational legacies for many in the community of Altadena. So what do we do? Well, I believe there are three core areas that must be intentionally addressed if we're able to restore these legacies of homeownership, right? One, Interim housing stability and rental assistance. This has also been mentioned before because it's also very important, right? It is the essential first step in recovery. Without it, rebuilding is almost impossible because people's loss of use coverage varies widely, and there's often not sufficient insurance to pay for interim housing for the life of the rebuilding process, right? It's also important that people who lost homes in Altadena can remain in or as close to the community as possible where they work and serve, and so many have deep, deep roots. Previous natural disasters have also taught us that where there is disparate impact, if people leave the community while waiting to rebuild, they are significantly less likely to return, and that will exacerbate the rate of displacement of people of color out of Altadena that was already happening before the fire. There's one specific example of a resident who is 50 years old, around 50 years old. She inherited a home from her father. In the time before the fire, she could count on one hand the number of times that she had moved in her entire life. In the 3 months after the fire, she moved 15 times, right? That's the type of thing that will prevent the stability necessary for her to rebuild. There was a local organization that entered into a direct leasing agreement with an apartment building to help get her access, and now she is in stable housing and can look to rebuilding. 2, rebuilding assistance grants. We all know that there are significant gaps in rebuilding in and above the cost of rebuilding in and above what FEMA or insurance will cover, right? It's imperative that grant funds are among the gap funds available for people to rebuild their homes, right? Now, look, I know the argument is that, okay, well, grant funds alone won't scale the magnitude of need, and I get that. Debt funds definitely have to be a part of this cocktail, but they are not a silver bullet. There's seniors, right, who are on fixed income, who maybe don't income qualify to get a loan to fill those financing gaps, right? There are people who worked for decades to pay off a home only to be forced to go into debt. And there are people in the Black community of Altadena who have attained home ownership and generational wealth in the face of overwhelming opposition perpetuated by a legacy of legal housing discrimination. We are telling them that we are going to take your equity if you are to remain, and that just won't do. Step 3. Land banking and community preservation. This was also talked about earlier, again, because it is such a crucial component of the rebuilding. And we know that natural disasters can significantly impact property values, leaving homeowners at risk for speculative investors in development looking to prioritize people over profit and what I like to call disaster capitalism, right? So for people who do make the heartbreaking decision to sell, as is their right, there need to be vetted, resourced organizations who have the community's best interest in mind, ready to purchase lots to keep them off the speculative market, and or a community network working together to see if a buyer can be identified from within the community, someone looking to return, which is already underway. This community control of land will ensure that the future use of that land is community-centered, community-informed, and will reflect the values identified by the community as being crucial in this rebuilding. Values like, and these are real-time values that the community has said, you have said, this needs to be present, right? Values such as climate-resilient building, community ownership of land, retaining the character of the neighborhood, accessibility to plans and permitting, long-term affordability, increasing available housing stock, right? Inventory was an issue before the fire. Economic and workforce development, and the focus of my work, preventing a further decline in the Black and Brown community of Altadena, and also making sure that homeownership preservation is central and wealth restoration is central. Friends, when community control and collaboration are achieved, there is so much good that can be done. For example, these are real time. A community housing organization being asked to purchase an apartment building in Altadena that survived the fire, and then planning to collect rents and set aside a portion of those rents for qualified tenants to go into a fund for a down payment to purchase a home, and then working with local affordable housing developers to identify properties to create a holistic pathway to homeownership. Or a land trust owning commercial space and offering affordable leases to make sure that business owners it's financially feasible for them to return. or a property owner who owned multiple properties as a landlord that burned down, but working with a local organization to rebuild on his lot so that his tenant that he had for 30 years can rebuild, and a private donor offering $200,000 in assistance to a stranger to make sure that she can make it happen. These are all happening in real time. Right? But this is a heavy lift. It's a heavy lift. And in order for it to work, it will require creative and courageous financing partnerships that include individuals and philanthropy and debt, as well as federal, state, and local funds. It will require recognizing that each organization participating in this recovery is but a spoke on the wheel of recovery, and that no one person, no one organization, and no one funding source can do it all. But together, we just might, right? I firmly believe that if we focus on these efforts and work in collaboration, we can not only rebuild homes, we can restore neighborhoods, preserve legacies, reestablish the ethnic and socioeconomic diversity that made Altadena unique, and truly imagine what this beautiful community could be. Thank you. Thank you.